Alright, today we'll be exploring the random module as well as some of its useful functions that we can use as part of the module. In the last video, we covered Python, in which we explored some of its common uses, as well as exploring the advanced feature that we can use as part of the programming language. So now we'll be taking a look at the random module. The random module will be especially useful for the following videos in this series, in which later on in the series, I'll be making a hangman and a Wordle game, in which in those games, we'll be generating a random word. And basically, since the purpose of those games is guessing a random word, we can make use of the random module in those games in order to actually make the Hangman and Wordle games work. So basically, the random module allows us to generate pseudo-random numbers. So the first thing that I want to go over is in order to actually use a module in our program, we need to first import it. So since we're doing import, the name of the module is random. Now we will be having access to the random module in our program. But if you get rid of this, we can't use its random function in our programs. We have to actually import it. So if we have import random, we have access to the functions of the random module. The first function that I'll be going over as part of the random module is randint. So basically the randint function is basically the purpose of it is so that we can generate a random number within a specific range. So the first thing that I want to do is declare a variable. I'm just going to say rand number and set that equal to, since I used import random, I'm going to have to first specify the name of the module and then dot in order to access the specific method or function that I want to use. So I have rand number equals random dot, and the way you say this is randint. So randint, and it expects us to pass in two arguments. The first argument that we need to pass in is the start range, and then the second argument that we pass in for randint is the end range. So, for example, if I pass in the arguments 1 and 5, it's going to be basically printing out a random number between 1 and 5. So here we have this 1, which is our start range, and then we have this comma, which means it separates these arguments. So our first argument is the start range, which is 1, the comma, and then the second argument we have here is the end range, which means it's only going to be printing out from 1 to 5. Our end range is going to be from 1 to 5. And it's not going to be printing out like 6, for example. It's only going to be printing out from start range to end range. And recall here we had this rand number, which equals to random.randint. And so basically these variables are useful since we can basically, it's basically a shorter way of using these. And it's also more readable. So we can see that this rand number is it's readable. But if you just have this print statement randint, we can see it's not really that readable. So that's why we use variables in our program, so that it's more readable for whoever's looking at our code. And so it'll be easier to understand what this random.randint is doing. This is basically a rand number, and set that equal to random.randint. So now that we declare a variable, and basically this random.randint is basically generating a random number and storing it inside this variable. So all we need to do left in order to see that it works is print rand number so that it prints it out to your terminal. So now that we run this, it's going to be printing out 1. But if you keep running this, we see that it's going to be printing out random numbers. And we see it's only printing out random numbers for 1 through 5. And also, both of these arguments are inclusive. So it's going to be including 1 in the range and including 5 in the range. So if I keep running this, you're going to see 1, 2, 4, 2. We keep running this until we actually see that 5 works. But we see this random int works. So we see it printing out 5. Now, if you want this second argument to be exclusive, now the next function I'll be going over is randrange, which is similar to randint, but the difference between randint and randrange is that for randint, the start range and end range is inclusive for randint, but for randrange, the start range is inclusive. However, the end range is exclusive. So since I'm using randrange from 1 to 5, this 1 is inclusive in generating a random number, but this second argument I'm passing in, which is the end range, is not going to be included. And so it's exclusive in generating a random number. So it's only going to be printing out a random number for 1 through 4 in this case. So now if I run this, you see, if I keep printing out, you see 1, 4. We see that it's never going to be printing out 5. If I keep running this, we see that it's generating a random number for 1 through 4 and not 5 since we use this randrange. But if you use randint, it's going to be generating a random number for 1 through 5. So we can basically specify our own start range or end range. So if I want to print out a random number from 10 to 100, I can simply do 10 and 100. And now if I run this, now we're going to be printing out random number from 10 to 100. And also another way we can do this is, since we're only using one function for this random module, we can just simply do from random, which means from this random module, I can import rand int. And when I do from import, I can get rid of this random dot. And also another thing that I want to point out is when you're using two functions, we're doing this from random import, rand in, but if I want to also use rand range, then I have to use a comma to separate these two functions. So if I type out rand range, you can see here that this is one function, comma, which means this is the one function I'm going to use, and this second, the one after this comma is the second function that I'm thinking of using in this program. So I'm going to be basically also using that. So random number 2 and saying that equal to rand range of, for example, I'm just going to do 10 to 100, but technically this should be printing out a random number from 10 to 99. So now if I print out rand number 2, and now if I run this, we see that now it's going to be printing out these two. And making sure that since our programs are reading it from top to bottom, it's going to be reading this print rand number first, and then it's going to be printing out this print rand number 2. So order also matters in our programs, in which basically our compiler will be reading it from top to bottom whenever running some code. So now if you run this, 1122, 85, 51. So now that we know how rand int, rand range, the last function that I'm going to be going over in this video is choice. So what choice basically does is that it's basically going to be generating a random element from a list, or we can also generate a random character from a string. So basically, choice is used on sequences, and recall that a string is an ordered sequences of characters, and that a list is an ordered sequence of data items. So we can use choice in order to generate a random data item or to generate a random character that is in that sequence. So we can basically generate a random data item from a list, or we can also generate a random character from a string. So I'm going to be basically doing from random import choice, which means I can simply just call choice and not having to do random.choice. So the first thing that I'm going to do after I import this from random import choice, demonstrate how this choice function works, is first of all, I'm going to be declaring a list. So I'm just going to say list of elements, which is the variable we have, and setting that equal to, and recall how a list works, is that we have these square brackets. And inside these square brackets, we can give our list of data items that we want to store as part of this list. So first data item I'm going to be specifying is programming. The next element is Python, and the last element I'll be giving for this example is Java. So the way that we use this is, first of all, I'm going to be declaring a variable, for example, rand choice, and setting that equal to, since I use from random import choice, I could simply just go into using choice on not random.choice. And here we see that we need to specify one argument, the argument being the sequence we have here. And since we have this list, which is a sequence, I'm going to be needing to pass in this argument of list elements. Since this choice requires us to pass in an argument of a sequence, I have this list elements declared up here, which is basically a list. I just need to pass in this argument of list and store that inside this variable. So basically what this rand choice is going to be doing is basically is going to either print out programming, is either going to be printing out Python, or it's going to be printing out Java. And basically that's what choice allows us to do. It's to select a random element from a list, or we can also use it with strings. So it allows us to select a random character from a string. And we see that this is going to be especially useful if you want to generate random words from a text file for the game we'll be making, which is Hangman and Wordle, in which we'll be generating a random word from a list. And we'll see how we are going to do that when we make Hangman and Wordle later on in the series. But in the case of this video, I'm just demonstrating how these functions work. So we have this rand choice equals choice, and then specifying the argument of the sequence. So now that we store inside this variable, I can simply just print out rand choice. And now if I print this out, it's going to be either printing out program Python Java. So here we see it's printing out Java, and if you keep printing out, we're going to see it's going to print out random elements. So programming Python Java, printing out random data items that are in the list, programming Python. So now that we see this works, we can also do this with strings. So instead of this list elements, I'm going to say, for example, stir and set that equal to programming. And now I need to replace this list element since it's an undefined name because I haven't initialized this variable anywhere in my program. But since we switched this to stir, now instead of list elements, I'm going to be passing the argument of stir. So therefore, this choice stir is going to be selecting a random character that is within the string and then storing that inside this variable. So now since I have this random choice equals choice stir, I don't need to change this variable since I kept the variable name the same. And now if I run this, we see it's going to be printing out random characters from a string. And that's basically how we can use choice, where we can generate a random data item or a character from a sequence. And that's how we can explore some of the useful functions of the random module, and as well as making use of it when we make the Hangman and Wordle game later on in the series. So now that we covered the random module and some of its useful basic functions that we can use as part of the random module, in the next video we're going to learn how to open files.